Good morning, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join. Thank you for attending. We'll just give everyone one more minute before we kick off.
No worries. Hopefully everyone can see the screen. If not, let me know.
Yep. Ashley, to everyone, so today's session is recorded, and after the webinar, we will send out a follow-up email to everyone with some information that Matt's gone through today and a link to the video, which you can share. Now, what we say will be recorded. However, anything in the chat will also be saved. So just keep aware of that. Now, because this is a webinar, unfortunately, you can't speak to us with your mic. However, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll answer them. I think let's get started.
Okay, let's do it. So thank you, Cameron, and thanks everyone that's joined so far. Today's session is going to be on risk assessments, and the aim really is just to provide a better understanding on what they are and how they relate to information security. So a fair bit to cover. It's quite a big topic. This session's around 10-15 minutes, so I'll try and keep it tight. Basically, we'll walk through the risk assessment process, how that can hopefully help drive a more proactive, cost-effective security strategy. As the agenda is outlined here, we'll explore the why, the what, the how risk assessment can enable you as business leaders to make better decisions with the right insights. So hopefully by the end of the webinar, you'll have a decent grasp on how to carry out a risk assessment that's not just a checkbox exercise, but something that genuinely helps protect your business. I'll also touch on compliance and frameworks, just briefly though, because they all have different terminology, but do follow a similar process. And then we'll sort of finish up with a highlight on some of the common traps, some of the pitfalls I've seen, and also some best practices. And then hopefully by the end, we'll have some time for some questions. So why risk assessments matter? Why should we care? And why should we prioritise risk assessments? Well, I think there's a few key ones we should consider. Firstly, identifying potential threats. So uncovering vulnerabilities and hazards before they cause harm or disruption. So, for example, cyber attacks, safety incidents, supply chain issues, etc. Secondly, minimizing negative impacts. So once we understand the potential consequences of risks, it allows us to put in proactive measures to reduce their severity. For example, financial losses, reputational damage, potentially legal liabilities, etc. Having a clear understanding of risks enables us to make more informed decision making with regards to strategic planning and resource allocation. So, we may find through analysis that prioritising a security investment or contingency planning is higher on the list. Ensuring compliance, that goes without saying. We're all obligated under certain legal, sometimes regulatory and contractual obligations to avoid penalties, such as Australians' data privacy laws, certain industry standards and regulatory bodies. Improve efficiency and resilience. So by addressing these potential disruptions, we can maintain not only smoother operations, but also more resilience and recovery can be much more effective from adverse events. Enhance stakeholder confidence. So what I've found in the past, especially with most of the time, it's due to a framework like ISO, where it does demonstrate due diligence to customers, investors, partners, even employees, right? It builds trust and credibility. And ultimately driving success, right? By proactively managing risks. We can better protect our assets, we can maintain stability through our infrastructure and our business, and increase our likelihood of achieving our objectives. A couple of key points on here this as well, I think, is what I've found is many SMBs overlook risk assessments. And that's one of the reasons why we're here today, trying to get a better understanding of it. It's not the dark art, so to speak. And one of the key things is risk management is significantly cheaper than reactive incident response. Potential financial losses, legal ramifications. I've found it to be much cheaper to have good risk management than have incident response all the time. So that'll lead us on to what is a risk assessment. Look, a risk assessment is really part of a larger risk management strategy, but it is at the core of it, as you can see from this particular graphic. Essentially, risk assessment is a structured process for identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities, analysing their impact and also their likelihood, and then deciding on how to manage them. It's core foundation to every solid cybersecurity strategy, whether it's compliance, as I mentioned, improving resilience, or just protecting our data, our information. To simplify it, really, it helps us answer three questions. What can go wrong? How likely is it to happen? And what would the impact be if it did? So think of it as like your cyber GPS. Right? Without it, you're kind of guessing where the threats might be. I've got this slide in here about categories. I think it's really important that risk assessment categories aren't necessarily just IT. Right? It's important to note that they span the entire business. Some key areas I've put here, some key categories, so to speak, to consider when doing risk assessments. Operational risks. So these are your day-to-day business processes, your efficiencies and business continuity. An example of this would be, say, a critical piece of software or web portal that is used for invoicing and or customer management, maybe experiencing a prolonged failure. Right? It's an operational risk. Financial and economic risks. So these are threats to our financial stability, our economic well-being, so to speak. An example of this could be pretty relevant at the moment, unexpected increases in interest rates, for example, making loan repayments much more difficult to pay. Compliance and legal. So failure to meet regulatory, contractual or legal obligations is probably a key risk to consider. For example, we know in Australia, not complying with Australian privacy laws regarding customer data handling can lead to potential penalties, and it has been done in the past and in South Australia as well in particular. Information and technology risks. So this is what a lot of people think cybersecurity risk assessment is all about, but it's just one part of it really. But the idea of this is threats to the CIA of our information and IT systems. And when I say CIA, not the American CIA, we're talking about the confidentiality, the integrity and the availability of information and IT systems. That's the core foundation for information security. So an example of a IT risk or information risk would be, say, a ransomware attack, right? Encrypting all of our business files and demanding a ransom for their release. Strategic and reputational risks. These are risks that really affect the achievement of our business goals and our public image, our reputation, so to speak. One really important thing that I'll probably touch on over and over is aligning our information security goals to our business goals. An example of a strategic or more of a reputational risk would be negative online reviews. Right? We get those, and that might have a significant impact on our reputation as well as potential customer acquisition, for example. Physical environmental. So this is mainly to do with dangers to physical assets from the environment, for example. This could include physical security around our premises, our data centers, our physical infrastructure. It could also be protection from the environment. An example of a risk here might be a fire in our business premises causing damage to the server room, for example. Or one that's probably a bit closer to home in some areas in Australia recently is maybe we operate in a cyclone or a flood zone. That would be a risk we'd probably want to consider under that category. Human capital and insider risks. So really we're talking about people here. We're talking about risks arising from employees, contractors, or other insider threats, for lack of a better term. And this, I think, really covers both intentional and unintentional actions. An example of this could be an employee accidentally deleting some critical financial records from a shared drive. That would be an example of an unintentional insider risk. So how do we conduct a risk assessment? So we can look at various frameworks, and I'll touch on them a little bit later, but essentially they all have slightly different terminology or processes. But to be more general, I would break it down into a 6-step process. It should be structured. Step 1 being our definition of our context of our business and the scope of what we're trying to protect, really. This is about setting the boundaries. What are we protecting? Who's involved? And what matters the most? So we start by defining the scope, which systems, assets, people are in play. What business objectives or compliance needs are we aiming to protect? It could be as simple as a HR system that stores employee records or payroll data used by internal staff only. Right? That will have different risks associated compared to, say, having to align with a regulatory body, for example, like APRA, CPS 234 or something like that. Step 2 is identifying risks. Right? What could go wrong? Let's consider the threats, the weaknesses, and the potential impacts of those risks. So it's really about identifying threats and vulnerabilities. Think of things like technical flaws, human error, malicious actors or threat actors, hackers, I guess, for a better term. An example would be, say, phishing, email phishing, right? Trying to trick staff into revealing login credentials. That may be a risk that's identified in this step. So once we've identified our risks, it's about assessing these risks, right? And this is generally based on likelihood and impact, right? How likely is it to occur, and how bad would it be if it did occur, right? So we assess the probability of the risk and its potential impact. If we consider, as an example, phishing as a risk, we would look at the likelihood first. And, this day and age, I would say the likelihood would be medium to very high, right? Very likely, I would say, because phishing is quite common. And the impact would be potentially high, maybe to very high significant, because they could potentially expose sensitive data like login credentials. Once we've done that, and I'll delve into the likelihood and impact analysis a bit later, because there is a structured approach for that as well. Risk evaluation. So we've got to determine our risk level, right? So we need to determine the risk level. We need to prioritize the risks that matter most, which ones need the most attention. To do this, we leverage back on the likelihood and impact. And this combining these two generally will give us a risk score or a risk level that then allows us to prioritize accordingly. So, for example, the phishing risk, it could be on a 1 to 5 scale, it could be very likely to occur. So it might be a 4, quite high on the 1 to 5. And the damage, the impact would be quite high as well. Let's say it's a 4 as well. 4 by 4 is 16. So on a scale of, 5 by 5, top score of 25, we're going to get a score of 20. That's going to be pretty high, right? So we kind of probably want to, put some countermeasures in place or mitigate that risk to an acceptable level. But I'll touch on that a little bit in a minute. So once we've categorized that and we've got our scores and we've got our categorization or classification of our risks, we've got to apply a risk treatment, right? We want to do something about these risks. How are we going to manage each risk? And for the most part, there's kind of 4 main actions or treatments, I should say, for risks. We can reduce the risk, which is probably what we want to do majority of the time. We can avoid the risk. We could share the risk, and then we can also accept the risk. So based on that risk level, we determine our response. Certainly if we're reducing, we're going to implement controls or safeguards. Something like transferring the risk might be cyber insurance, for example. That's transferring the risk to a cyber insurance company. Or it could be low likelihood, low impact or low consequence, and therefore we may be willing to accept that risk. Okay. Another reason for acceptance could be that the cost of reducing that risk might significantly outweigh the damage caused by that risk eventuating. Right? So mitigating phishing, for example, it's high, we want to mitigate that. So for an example would be, okay, we want to implement MFA across all our accounts. That's a control that we can put in place to reduce that risk. We may want to introduce staff awareness training on how to identify and manage phishing emails. And we may want to implement stronger email filtering controls. And then step 6, and this will come up a bit later as well, is the review and monitor stage. So this is really important. Risks are not static. They should always be kept under review. We want to monitor the risks. We want to monitor the controls against those risks over time, especially after major changes. So I would say at least once a year would be a good cadence for risk management, risk assessment. And reviewing the phishing risk, for example, might show that over time, over a quarter, for example, you've reviewed that risk and you've reviewed it as low now, right? Because the mitigation controls are now effective. Doesn't have to be overly complex, but it should be consistent. So far as we define our scope clearly, try and keep it simple. We don't have to go and boil the ocean, so to speak. And then we just step through the process step by step, okay? The whole goal of it is to make informed, defensible decisions and a plan that you can actually enact upon. So in brief slides, I talked about a 5 by 5 matrix. This is quite common for risk assessments. Each framework will have a slightly different one, so I've just tried to give an example that's fairly generic. But this is an example of a 5x5 risk matrix. So you'll see on the left-hand side, we've got our likelihood from rare up to almost certain. And across the top, we've got our consequence, which is from insignificant to severe. As I mentioned earlier with phishing, we might have given that a 4 scoring of likely, it's likely to occur, and it's a major impact. So we end up with a very high score of 16. Now, this is where context and scope, specifically context of our organization, is really important. If we need to determine our risk tolerance level. We need to determine what we're willing to accept and what we're not willing to accept, because at the end of the day, we can't just accept everything, right? But we can't also, mitigate everything, right? And we'd have to deep dive into how that's calculated. We need to be doing business impact analysis and various other things to understand. And it's very important that context, step one, is defined, and we include leadership in that, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be potentially accountable. They're also going to be the ones that are providing resources, especially if it's for a mitigation or a reduction by applying controls. There may be resources required, not only commercially, but also from a human resource perspective. They also determine, what level of approval is required to accept a risk. Because once we apply controls, what happens is we're going to have a residual risk. So our initial risk could be 16. We're going to apply MFA. We're going to increase our email security. We're going to do cyber awareness training, targeting phishing emails in particular. After we apply those controls and we review it, we're going to have a residual risk. And hopefully it's much less, and hopefully we're willing to accept that, okay? Step 5 in that risk treatment process, I touched on treatment strategies, and I just want to delve a bit deeper into that because I think it's really important. So as I said, once we've identified and assessed them, we need to make a decision on what to do with them. What are we going to do about them? There are generally 4 main treatment strategies. There's a couple of others in various frameworks and around the place, but if you stick to these 4, you're pretty much good to go. The first one is accept or retain. So I'm going to use 2 words for each, because depending on the framework you might have information on, they use different terminology for the same thing. But the first one is accept to retain. So basically here we're acknowledging the risk, and we're willing to accept the potential impact. Right. Now, this is typically used when a risk is low or within our risk tolerance or our risk acceptance. Right? And that is usually defined in our scope, and it's usually defined by leadership. An example of this might be, it's a minor risk, it's low, and it's cheaper just to accept it than to apply any more additional countermeasures or safeguards or security controls. They would certainly be candidates if they are low likelihood with minimal impact. The next treatment method or strategy is to avoid or to terminate. Right? And this is completely removing the source of the risk by stopping either the associated activity or removing it completely from our infrastructure. To give you an example, a classic one I've seen is retiring an unsupported legacy system like a Windows Server 2008 machine that is not really in use anymore, can't be upgraded. It's cheaper for us, it's better for us to actually remove that from our environment completely. And that's an example of avoiding or terminating the risk. Or it could be, say, cancelling a project, right, because it has too much risk exposure. That would be avoiding or terminating that particular risk. The next one is transferring or sharing the risk. So this is about shifting the responsibility or the financial impact to another party. Classic example is cyber insurance, right? Or outsourcing to a managed SOC provider or something similar like that. That's transferring the risk. Mitigate or reduce. And this is the big one. This is the one I see the most of. This is about applying controls. Now, a control can be various things, but basically it's a safeguard is another word for it. We're applying safeguards to lower either the likelihood and or the impact of the risk. Right? Sometimes we can't reduce both. For example, we can't have much influence on the likelihood of an earthquake to occur or a cyclone to occur, right? But we can potentially reduce the impact with good business continuity, with various other countermeasures. Another look at another different type of control would be enabling multi-factor authentication. That is a control. Patching of systems, enforcing backups, delivering ongoing staff awareness training, maybe implementing a policy or a procedure for a specific process within a business. They're all examples of controls used to mitigate risk. So really the key takeaway there is the best strategy depends on the specific risk, its potential impact, and the business's risk appetite or risk acceptance level. I'm not going to spend too much time on compliance and frameworks, but the key thing I want to point out here is that risk assessment and risk management is basically at the core of all the leading cybersecurity and compliance frameworks. And they have some real value because they provide structure is a good one. They have a very structured approach to risk assessments and risk management, and they are designed in a way that is repeatable, it's objective and quite comprehensive. Because of that, they also help us prioritize, make informed decisions, because they are specifying that we really need to understand our business context, right? And that's really important. Most of the good frameworks will support regular review, right? They say you have to have risk assessments at least annually or upon change, for example, otherwise you won't comply. And this kind of drives continuous improvement, right? And refinement of controls, refinement of risks. They support audit and certification, of course, demonstrates due diligence and maturity over time to external auditors, to regulators, to customers, to stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier. They're also really good at mapping, I would say, controls to risks, right? Or risks to controls. So most of the frameworks, NIST and ISO, etc., have a control library or a safeguard library, and they allow us to have some structure in bridging the gap between risk identification and control implementation. They give us really good structure, that's the key. ISO is great for repeatable, audit-friendly assessments. NIST is also highly adaptable. My advice in Australia would be, if you're going to go down this path, you'd align with probably both NIST and ISO, because not only will you improve your overall security posture, you're going to meet any regulatory expectations. With compliance and frameworks, I think that the key thing here to understand is, irrespective of the specific framework, the standard or regulatory requirement, as I mentioned earlier, their terminology does differ slightly, but they all fundamentally embrace the same process of identify, assess, treat, and monitor. And this is the core that provides a really nice, consistent, effective approach for managing information security risks, and ultimately, if you want to, achieving compliance. Okay, so let's just touch on some common pitfalls that I've seen in the last few years, the don'ts, so to speak. So I think keeping it simple and aligning it with your business objectives, right? Make it an annual thing as well. This is one of the key things I've seen. Risks should be identified and aligned to your specific business's real-world operations or objectives. If the executive or leadership team don't understand the impact, no action will get taken. So, context, business impact is really important. Poor risk prioritization is another one. Focus on low impact or unlikely issues. I probably wouldn't be doing that. I'll be focusing on the other end of the scale first. The other thing I see is like no consistent criteria for likelihood and impact ratings. This is really important as well. No ongoing risk culture. So often I've seen risk being treated as a one-time activity. No follow through on treatment or regular reviews. This is really important. And that leads into the next one, right? Weak accountability. If there's no clear owners of risks, there'll be no follow through, right? Once someone's been assigned something or they're the owner of something, you're generally going to get some sort of action taken. Also, controls being defined but never implemented or tested. That ties in with the ownership of identified risks. And blind spots, right? We mentioned the categories earlier. Ignoring human error, for example, or social engineering, overlooking external threats like vendors or supply chains. They're commonly overlooked. So most of the time I would add not aligning outcomes to a roadmap or controls, is really important. And this is where the frameworks can really assist, right? Especially with the mapping of safeguards or controls to specific risks. So far as best practices, the do's, you'll probably see the underlying theme here is probably the opposite of the don'ts. But leadership buy-in is key, right? From the start, top-down commitment is crucial, and also including key people from key departments so we can cover those categories, right? People in HR are going to identify different risks to people in IT. Aligning with business objectives, right? Tie risks to systems, data, strategic goals potentially, right? Working cross-functionally, right? I've mentioned this before, involving various departments and key people from the beginning. So whether it's IT, HR, maybe legal and compliance, operations, leadership, executives. It'll provide better insights and you'll get that buy-in from those people. Prioritize what matters the most, right? If we're using consistent risk ratings like likelihood and impact, we've defined our business impact analysis, etc. Let's focus on what matters the most to us, okay? Focus on high value, high risk areas first. Making risk assessment an ongoing, not a one-off process. It's really important that we review, retest and update. Allows us to adapt quickly to change, right? New threats, new people, new technology, for example. Own it and act on it. We mentioned that as well, right? Let's assign risk owners. Let's track treatments, right? These best practices I've found will generally turn these risk assessments into very powerful tools, right? Not just reports or spreadsheets that collect dust, right? Just to finish before we go into Q&A, just a couple of key things here. There's no need to wait for perfection. Just start, right? Every step forward reduces risk, right? If you're stuck, Cam, myself, and the rest of the team here are happy to help and guide you through it. Start small, document everything, make it a habit, right? And reach out if you need help from us.
Thanks, Matt. That was great. I think what you said in the last slide was great as well. So, focus on what matters to us is really important. So having like a tailored approach to your cybersecurity and a strategy with your budget instead of just spending on what might not be important for the business. Now we have some questions here.
Yep.
The first one for you. Are there certain levels of organisational maturity or internal systems that need to be in place before conducting a risk assessment, which could influence the effectiveness or the value of the activity?
Do I have chat here? Because you broke up a couple of bits there. Hang on. Let's have a look at that question. I would say no. Okay, there's no better time to start than now. If you don't have if you consider this that you have a low maturity, it doesn't mean you can't. It would essentially be a perfect candidate to be on the risk register. That's what I would say.
Yep. Okay, I think that was it. Thank you everyone for attending today. Like I said at the start, this session has been recorded, so we'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the video. Feel free to share it to your complete contact list. And yeah, if you have any questions or any follow-up questions, feel free to get in contact. Thank you.
Thanks, Cameron. Thanks everyone. That was just for you, mate.
Okay, we're going to end the meeting now. Thank you.
All right.